Most cases had been dismissed without serious consequences. The laughter of children echoed from the playground. Joggers passed by with rhythmic strides, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe lingered in the air. Naomi Carter sat on a bench, a thick legal book resting on her lap. A woman of confidence, intelligence, and unwavering resolve. She had spent the day in court, advocating for a client in a civil rights case, and now she was enjoying a rare moment of peace. But peace, for people like her, never lasted long. A shadow loomed over her, then another. Two uniformed officers stood before her, their expressions unreadable, their presence unmistakably authoritative. "Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity in this area. May we ask what you're doing here?" The question was casual on the surface, but Naomi had heard that tone before. She had seen it in countless cases. The kind that started with a seemingly harmless inquiry and ended with handcuffs. She met their gaze, her voice steady. "I'm sitting here, reading." The taller officer, his badge reading Brooks, crossed his arms. "Do you live around here?" The question made her jaw tighten. She exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Is there a reason you're questioning me?" A flicker of something impatience, or perhaps irritation, crossed Brooks' face. His partner, Daniels, stood slightly behind, his stance rigid, fingers grazing the edge of his belt. "It's a routine check," Brooks replied. "Can I see some identification?" Naomi didn't move. She studied them the way she had studied so many officers in courtrooms, watching for tells, for signs of intent. The park was open to the public. There was no crime, no reason for suspicion. Yet here she was, being treated like a threat. She reached into her bag, pulling out her ID, her fingers tightening around it before handing it over. Brooks examined it for longer than necessary, flipping it over as if expecting to find something incriminating. Daniels shifted his weight. "What exactly are you doing in this neighborhood?" A moment of silence. Then, Naomi let out a dry chuckle. "I work 3 blocks from here, at the county courthouse." That made them pause. Brooks' gaze flickered with something hesitation, or maybe calculation. Daniels, however, remained unmoved. "Have you been here long?" Naomi's patience thinned. "Officer, is there a reason for this interrogation?" Brooks stiffened. "Just answering questions would be easier, ma'am." Naomi knew this pattern. She had heard these words from clients who had been stopped for simply existing in spaces where others believed they didn't belong. She had fought against this exact kind of profiling in court, and now it was happening to her. She straightened. "I'd like to know if I'm being detained, or if I'm free to go." The atmosphere tensed. Daniel's hand now rested on his holster, a subtle but deliberate move. Brooks exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, if you refuse to comply, we might have to take you in for obstruction." A single word could change everything. She knew it. They knew it. Naomi chose her words carefully. "Obstruction of what, exactly?" Brooks' patience snapped. "Stand up. Turn around. Hands behind your back." The metallic click of handcuffs filled the air. A woman nearby gasped. A jogger slowed his pace, looking on with confusion. Naomi, despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins, remained still as the cold steel tightened around her wrists. Her heart pounded, not out of fear but out of a deep burning anger. She had done nothing. And yet, here she was. A student on the other side of the park, Sophie Miller, fumbled for her phone. The camera lens focused on Naomi, her hands bound behind her back, her face calm but her eyes filled with fire. The recording had begun, and in a few hours, the world would see. The tight grip on Naomi's arms didn't loosen as Brooks and Daniels pulled her up from the bench. The world around her felt distant, muted conversations, the occasional bark of a dog, the rhythmic pounding of a jogger's footsteps. But Naomi's focus was sharp. She knew exactly what was happening, and she knew that they knew what they were doing was wrong. Brooks adjusted the cuffs, tightening them just enough to make a point. "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate. This doesn't have to be difficult." Naomi let out a slow breath, keeping her voice level. I've done nothing but cooperate. I gave you my ID. I answered your questions. Now I'm being detained for what? Exactly? Daniels smirked. For obstruction and resisting. A sharp laugh escaped Naomi's lips. Resisting what? Sitting on a park bench? Brooks' jaw tightened. His patience was wearing thin. You're being difficult. Naomi met his gaze, unwavering. I'm a lawyer. I know my rights, and I know you have no legal reason to detain me. For the first time, Brooks hesitated. Just a flicker of doubt. A brief moment where his grip loosened, as if reconsidering. But Daniels wasn't backing down. Let's not make this worse. Turn around, and don't say another word. A small crowd had begun to form, silent observers, exchanging glances, unsure whether to intervene. Some simply looked away, unwilling to get involved. But Sophie Miller wasn't one of them. From the other side of the park, she watched through her camera lens, her fingers trembling as she hit record. The zoomed-in screen framed Naomi's wrists, locked in cuffs, Brooks standing over her, Daniels shifting uneasily. Sophie had seen videos like this before, viral clips of wrongful arrests, excessive force, power abused in broad daylight. But this was different. This was happening right in front of her. Naomi kept her voice measured. You're making a mistake. Daniels let out a dry chuckle. Is that so? You're detaining a citizen with no probable cause, no crime committed. You have no legal grounds. Brooks exhaled sharply, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Lady, we got a call about suspicious activity. You match the description. Naomi's stomach twisted. She had heard those words before. In court, in cases she had fought against. She kept her voice even. And what exactly was the description? Daniel's smirk returned. A woman, sitting alone, acting suspiciously. A humorless chuckle. Naomi shook her head. So existing is a crime now? Brooks pulled at her arm, steering her toward their patrol car. That's enough. The small crowd murmured now, shifting uncomfortably. A few people pulled out their phones, recording from a distance. But Sophie was the only one daring to step closer, her phone camera held steady. She took a deep breath and spoke. Excuse me, officers. Can you explain why she's being arrested? Daniels turned sharply, his expression darkening. Back up. Sophie didn't move. I'm just asking, I said. Back up. Brooks shot her a warning glare before turning back to Naomi. Let's go. Naomi didn't resist as they led her toward the car, but her heart pounded in rage. Sophie's camera followed their every move. She knew this was wrong, and now she had proof. As Naomi was forced into the back seat, the metal door slamming shut behind her, Sophie whispered under her breath, "This is going viral." It started as a trickle, a few retweets, a handful of shares, some angry comments. Then it exploded. Within hours, the video of Naomi's arrest was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. News outlets picked it up. Headlines screamed injustice. Lawyer wrongfully arrested in broad daylight. Officers detain woman FRSI while black. Another example of police abuse, and this time it was caught on camera. Millions watched as Naomi remained calm under pressure, as Brooks and Daniels threw baseless accusations, as she was forced into the patrol car, despite having done nothing wrong. The comment sections flooded with outrage. This is disgusting. They had no reason to arrest her. How many times does this have to happen before real change is made? The fact that she's a lawyer and they still did this? What hope does the average person have? They didn't even try to justify it. Just straight-up power abuse. A hashtag emerged. Justice for Naomi. It trended within hours. Civil rights groups weighed in. The ACLU released a statement demanding accountability. Activists called for the officer's suspension. Lawyers, journalists, even celebrities spoke up, amplifying the call for justice. But no one was angrier than Marissa Blake. The moment she saw the video, she was already on her way to the police station. She stormed through the doors, her voice sharp, unwavering. I need to see Naomi Carter. Now. The officer at the desk barely looked up. Ma'am, you'll have to wait. No, I won't. Marissa leaned in, her hands pressed firmly on the counter. My friend is in one of your holding cells, arrested for absolutely nothing, and I need to see her. Now. A pause. A flicker of hesitation. The officer cleared his throat. What's her name? Naomi Carter, and I'll be posting bail immediately. The process dragged on longer than it should have. Marissa knew they were stalling. But an hour later, Naomi stepped out, her wrists sore, her expression unreadable. Marissa rushed to her side. Are you okay? Naomi exhaled slowly. I will be. The two women walked out of the station together, straight into a crowd of reporters. Microphones and cameras shoved forward. A barrage of questions erupted at once. Miss Carter, why do you think you were arrested? Will you be taking legal action? Do you believe this was racial profiling? Naomi didn't hesitate. She took a step forward, letting the cameras capture her face, her bruised wrists, the quiet fury simmering behind her eyes. This wasn't just an arrest, she said, her voice steady. This was an abuse of power. Flashbulbs flickered. Reporters leaned in. I was detained without cause. I was harassed without reason. And I was treated like a criminal for daring to question authority. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. I refuse to let this go unanswered. I refuse to let this happen to someone else. A pause. Then, I will be filing a lawsuit against the police department. The crowd erupted. Marissa placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. The message was clear. This fight was just beginning. The lawsuit was filed at exactly 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. By noon, every major news network had picked up the story. Naomi Carter sues police department for unlawful arrest. Civil rights attorney takes on law enforcement in groundbreaking case. Will justice be served? The lawsuit demanded a full investigation into the department's handling of Naomi's arrest. It called for the suspension of officers Ryan Brooks and Daniel Carter, compensation for damages, and most importantly, a public admission of wrongdoing. But the police department wasn't going down without a fight. Their lawyers, high-paid, politically connected, ruthless, responded with a motion to dismiss. Their argument? The officers were simply following protocol. Naomi had been uncooperative. There was no evidence of racial bias. A familiar script. A tired excuse. But the public wasn't buying it. Inside the police department, Ryan Brooks was sweating. The video had already reached millions of views. His face was plastered across social media. His name trending for all the wrong reasons. People were demanding accountability. Fire them both. This is exactly why we need police reform. How many more times will this happen before real change is made? Everywhere he turned, someone was talking about him. His neighbors, his wife's friends, even his own colleagues were whispering behind his back. At first, he tried to brush it off. It'll blow over, he told himself. These things always do. But then the internal affairs investigation was announced. And suddenly, it wasn't just public outrage. It was official scrutiny. His badge, his career, his entire future was on the line. Daniels wasn't handling it any better. During roll call, he could feel the stares, the tension. Some officers stood by him. Others kept their distance. And then there were the ones who outright resented him for bringing bad press to the department. The captain pulled them both into his office that afternoon. Do you have any idea the kind of heat you've brought down on this department? Brooks sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight. Daniels kept his eyes on the floor. People are looking for someone to blame, the captain continued. And if this lawsuit doesn't go away, it's going to be you two. A loaded silence. Then, in a lower voice more warning than reassurance, he added, You'd better hope those lawyers know what they're doing. While the police department scrambled to contain the fallout, Naomi and her legal team were preparing for war. Marissa had already gathered statements from eyewitnesses. Sophie Miller's video, clear, undeniable evidence, was ready to be presented in court. And Naomi? She was more determined than ever. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced. For every wrongful arrest. Every abuse of power. Every victim who never got justice. This case wasn't just about her. It was about all of them, and she wasn't backing down. The irony of fate could not have been more profound. Naomi Carter, once forcibly handcuffed, now stood at the highest seat of judgment. It was a call she hadn't expected. A formal letter from the Judicial Committee informed her that she had been assigned to oversee an internal disciplinary hearing, a standard procedure in cases where police officers faced allegations of misconduct. At first, she read the document without much thought, but when she saw the names listed in the case file, her breath caught in her throat. Ryan Brooks, Daniel Carter, the very same officers who had violated her rights. For a long moment, she simply stared at the paper. A cruel joke? A mistake? But it was neither. Her reputation as a sharp, fair, and uncompromising legal professional had earned her a seat on this panel. She had worked for years to build her credibility, and now, that credibility had led her here to the opportunity of a lifetime. The system that once tried to silence her had now placed her in the ultimate position of power. The weight of responsibility. That night, she barely slept, not because of rage, not because of revenge, but because of the responsibility. The weight of justice was heavy, and she refused to wield it out of personal grievance. This case had to be decided by law, not emotion. For all the years she had fought against bias in the legal system, she refused to become another example of it. She would listen, she would weigh the evidence, and she would decide not as Naomi Carter, the victim, but as Judge Carter, the impartial authority. It was the only way to ensure that justice truly meant something. The moment of reckoning. The day of the hearing arrived. A large, formal courtroom, dark wooden panels, rows of chairs filled with observers, reporters, and legal professionals, and at the center Naomi Carter, presiding. She entered the chamber with steady, deliberate steps, her black robe flowing behind her. All eyes were on her, but two faces, in particular, were frozen in shock. Ryan Brooks, Daniel Carter. For the first time, they were not the ones in control. For the first time, they were the ones who had to answer. Their postures stiffened, their jaws tightened. But Naomi saw it, the flash of disbelief, the flicker of panic. They had never expected this, to stand in front of her, to have their fate decided by the very woman they had humiliated, arrested, and dismissed. Ryan Brooks clenched his fists under the table. Daniel Carter swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. They had walked into this room expecting business as usual, another routine hearing, another case they could brush off. Instead, they found her, a woman who had every reason to destroy them, and yet she sat there with calm authority, unmoved by their discomfort. She did not gloat, she did not smirk, she simply opened the case file, her voice steady and commanding. This hearing will now begin. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every breath, every movement, every subtle shift in expression carried weight. This was not just a hearing. This was a reckoning, a moment where power dynamics reversed, where those who had once stood above the law were now forced to answer to it. Naomi Carter sat at the center of it all, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. She was not just watching the proceedings, she was commanding them. And Brooks and Daniels knew it. The prosecution strikes first. The prosecution wasted no time. The lead attorney stood, his voice sharp and direct. He laid out the foundation of the case with precision, citing patterns of misconduct and highlighting a troubling history of excessive force from both officers. This is not an isolated incident, he stated. A projector flickered to life. Internal records flashed across the screen, complaints, disciplinary warnings, reports buried within the system. Brooks and Daniels had a history, and it wasn't pretty. There were multiple complaints, primarily from minority individuals, alleging racial profiling, unjustified stops, and use of excessive force. Most cases had been dismissed without serious consequences, until now, until there was undeniable video proof, until they had picked the wrong person to target. A new witness takes the stand. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A young man stepped inside, hesitant but resolute. Ethan Harris, another victim of Brooks and Daniels. He took the stand, adjusting the microphone, his hands visibly shaking. Naomi watched closely, not just as a judge, but as someone who understood what it meant to be in his shoes. Ethan recounted his story, how he had been stopped, how they had pushed him against a wall, how they had thrown him onto the pavement over a minor infraction. He spoke of the bruises, of the fear, of the shame. They laughed while they did it, he said, his voice almost breaking. He looked directly at Brooks and Daniels. I remember your faces. Silence fell over the courtroom. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Daniels clenched his jaw, but neither of them could look Ethan in the eye. The defense scrambles. The defense attorney rose, adjusting his suit, his demeanor controlled. He tried to dismiss Ethan's account as a misunderstanding, an exaggeration. He argued that police procedures required a level of force to maintain safety, that Brooks and Daniels had been doing their jobs. That may be true, the prosecutor countered, but was it necessary? Another flick of the projector. Sophie Miller's video began to play. The moment Naomi had been stopped, the moment Brooks had grabbed her wrist, the moment Daniels had snapped the handcuffs around her arms, the way she had remained calm. Despite their escalation, the footage spoke for itself. The defense attorney shifted. He knew. There was no talking around this. No reframing the facts. The evidence was clear. Brooks brags. Daniels defends. For the first time since the hearing began, Brooks looked shaken. He lowered his head, his shoulders tense. There was regret in his eyes, a realization that he had gone too far, that he had finally been caught. But Daniels refused to give in. His face remained hardened, his pride intact. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting through the silence. This is ridiculous, he muttered. He tried to justify his actions, claimed that compliance would have avoided the situation, that he had done nothing wrong, that this entire hearing was a witch hunt. Naomi did not react. She simply watched, studied his face, his tone, his lack of remorse. He still believed he could get away with it, but today he wouldn't, because today power belonged to justice, not to a badge. And Naomi Carter was here to make sure of that. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself as the courtroom fell into silence. The evidence had been laid out. The testimonies had been heard. The weight of justice now rested on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some waiting for a harsh ruling, others watching for any sign of bias. But she had made her decision long before stepping into this chamber, not based on anger, not based on revenge, but on truth. She looked up, her expression unreadable, and delivered her verdict. Ryan Brooks and Jason Daniels had abused their authority. The ruling was clear. Brooks would be suspended without pay for 6 months. Daniels would be terminated from the force, effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The consequences were severe, but they were justified. For too long, officers like them had acted with impunity, knowing that the system would shield them. Today, that shield had cracked. Daniels stiffened, his jaw tightening as the words sank in. His fingers curled into fists. He wanted to protest, wanted to lash out, but he couldn't. There was no argument left to make, no lie left to tell. The evidence had spoken louder than he ever could. Without another word, he pushed back his chair and stormed out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Brooks, however, remained seated. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped together, but there was something different in his expression. Regret. When the room began to clear, he stood and approached Naomi cautiously, his voice low but steady. I was wrong. The words hung in the air, almost foreign coming from him. Naomi studied his face. Unlike Daniels, Brooks wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He looked tired. For the first time, he seemed to understand the damage he had caused. I don't expect forgiveness, he added, but I needed to say it. Naomi didn't respond right away. She didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't, but she gave him a nod, a simple acknowledgement that she had heard him. That was enough. As Brooks turned to leave, Naomi exhaled, letting the weight of the trial drain from her chest. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. The verdict had been delivered, but its impact was just beginning. News of the trial spread like wildfire. Clips from the courtroom circulated on social media, each frame capturing the weight of the moment: Naomi's unshaken resolve, Daniel's simmering resentment, Brooke's quiet regret. The case ignited a nationwide debate about policing, accountability, and justice. People took to the streets, demanding change. Activists, legal experts, and community leaders called for sweeping reforms in law enforcement policies. For years, stories like Naomi's had been buried, dismissed as isolated incidents. Not this time. The public refused to look away. Naomi found herself at the center of the movement, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance. She wasn't seeking the spotlight, but she knew she couldn't stay silent. Invitations poured in: panel discussions, legal forums, news interviews. Her words carried weight, and people were listening. At a town hall event, she stood before a packed auditorium, facing a sea of expectant faces. "This case wasn't just about me," she said, her voice unwavering. "It was about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or told that their rights don't matter." A thunderous applause erupted. She spoke about transparency in law enforcement, about the need for independent oversight, about how true justice wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about fixing a broken system. The more she spoke, the clearer her path became. One evening, as she sifted through piles of letters and emails, one message stood out. It was from a prominent civil rights organization. They were launching an initiative to push for judicial reform, and they wanted her on board. Her work as a judge was far from over, but this was something bigger, a chance to shape policies beyond the courtroom. She read the email again, feeling a shift within her. This case had started with an unjust arrest. Now, it was about something greater, a fight that was only just beginning. The verdict had been rendered, the case closed, but its repercussions were only beginning to take shape. Naomi had won not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Yet, this victory was not about a single case. It was about challenging a system that had, for too long, operated without accountability. The police department, facing immense public pressure, announced a series of sweeping reforms. New mandatory de-escalation training was introduced. Body cameras became a requirement, not an option. A civilian oversight board was established, something activists had fought for years to achieve. For the first time in decades, real change was happening. But the road ahead remained long. Naomi knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only a new beginning. More cases of police misconduct began coming to light. Victims, once too afraid to speak, now stepped forward, emboldened by Naomi's courageous stand. In a live interview, she was asked if she considered herself a hero. She smiled faintly before shaking her head. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm just one person who refused to stay silent." That refusal had inspired thousands. A young law student, watching from across the country, decided to specialize in civil rights law. A woman who had been wrongly arrested filed her own lawsuit, no longer willing to accept injustice. The ripple effect was immeasurable. And Naomi? She was far from done. She continued her work, both on the bench and in the community. At a packed university auditorium, she addressed a crowd of students, activists, and legal professionals. "Justice isn't just about laws," she said, her voice clear and firm. "It's about people. It's about holding power accountable. And it starts with us." The standing ovation was deafening. As Naomi stepped off the stage, a young woman approached her, eyes shining with determination. "You made me believe that we can change things," she said, "that our voices matter." Naomi nodded. "Because they do," she replied. "The fight for justice would never be easy, but it would always be worth it." Naomi's story is just one of many. Every day, people stand up against injustice, demanding accountability and change. If her story resonated with you, if you believe in fairness, truth, and the power of justice, then we invite you to be part of this journey. Subscribe to Trial Tales for more powerful stories of legal battles, injustice, and the fight for truth. Because justice isn't just a concept, it's a fight. And it starts with you.